Parker, Managing Editor of Math Devices, Medical Design and Outsourcing. Welcome to our webinar about methods and tools you can use to reduce innovation risk. So a few housekeeping items before we start. This webinar will be available at medicaldesignandoutsourcing.com. Use today's login to link in for on-demand viewing. We actually won't have a resource widget, but if you're interested in acquiring these slides, you can reach out to Ximedica and they can provide them to you. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. Even watching on demand, still ask questions. We could answer them later on. And tweet with us at the hashtag MDOWebinar and the handle Ximedica. Our guest today includes Ximedica Innovation VP Joe Gordon. Joe is joined by Tom Lutzow, who directs Human Factors Industrial Design at the medical device developer. John and Tom, welcome to MDO.
Welcome, thank you.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Just to let everybody know, Joe and Tom are great experts to discuss this topic. That's because Ximedica has developed and refined its early phase development process to better identify and mitigate programmatic risk elements. After this webinar, you'll hopefully be able to better understand how to execute methods to identify and prioritize risk areas. Plus, you'll have more know-how when it comes to understanding robust innovation processes that can improve programmatic efficiency. So we're going to hand this webinar over to Joe and Tom now so we can delve more into the details.
All right, so hello everybody. This is Joe Gordon, just to calibrate to the voice. I'll start with just a quick high-level overview of Ximedica. The excerpt I'll read right from that one is just expediting the development of innovative, user-focused healthcare products. So we're a product development consultancy, work with major medicals as well as smaller startups, and the product diversity is across the map, from everything from high-volume disposables to complex capital with disposable interfaces.
And another, just to add to that as well, I mean, what really helps differentiate us here is really the key set of resources that we've been able to acquire here at Ximedica. We've got a really great group of folks that work here, very collaborative in nature, and it's a great team.
Yeah, so the company's been around for over 30 years. We actually have offices in Providence, which is our main headquarters, and we also have development offices in Minneapolis as well as in San Francisco. And we also have a DX facility that's in Los Gatos, California, that also allows us to increase our diagnostic capability. Here's just some examples of some of the products I was mentioning. You can see the high volume, a lot of combination devices for drug delivery systems, right up to a surgical robot in the bottom right for Titan Medical.
A lot of our roots here at Ximedica were founded more mainly in consumer products, and you'll see that some of them sort of, along some of the slides here, you'll see some dental products and things, and we've sort of evolved about 15 or so years ago more into the full medical space. And this sort of, Joe, gives you a good sense here of the spectrum of types of things that we work on here as a team. So this slide sort of speaks to a little bit about the way how we define human-centered innovation here at Ximedica. It's a little unique to us and how we think about it. And we really think about human-centered innovation as really the intersection or cross-section of the user or the user needs and how that works across the technologies that we're working on. And anytime we start a new program or a new activity here, we're going to try to get a bit better, a deeper understanding of really what the business strategies are that we're working towards or we're challenging against, and what those might be, whether those are cost-related strategies or other things are really key drivers or challenges for the business of the program that we're working on at that point. So this is sort of, we want to make sure that we're thinking about these three things all at the same time, and it's something that's really core to all of our programs here.
Yeah, so jumping into a little bit of the nuts and bolts, I'd say one of the first tools that we utilize to hit that goal of best balancing those different opposing needs that Tom was just alluding to. This first one here is just basically a program calibration activity that ranks the program-specific criteria. So this is a great opportunity for us to align with our clients Obviously, as mentioned, we have small startup companies as well as major medical, and if they start a program initiative, they're going to have different goals. But we also get surprised quite often where even a major medical can sometimes come in and have a different segment of their company that may act a little bit more like a startup. So what we do is we'll work with them as early as the kickoff meeting to identify what metrics are most important to the development activity. What are the key drivers that we should be considering as we embark on the actual detailed design or the concept generation. So what we have here is an example of one of these that's already populated. So with this client, what we did is we worked through these 9 different criteria. Time to market, pretty self-explanatory, although we do make sure that we clarify what we mean by that. So sometimes time to market represents a product launch. Other times, time to market is really about getting to a clinical goal or a first in human. And once again, that's maybe not something that had been clarified adequately. So sometimes we embark on a project, we sit there at the client kickoff meeting, and then all of a sudden we're saying, wait a minute. So we really should set our sights towards that clinical use rather than that time to market or that commercial launch. Development cost, we really link these to time as well as the dollars required to do so. So Ximedica is a consultancy, so we're fee for service. So sometimes there's different opposing needs that are present there, and we can actually act in a more efficient manner if we're able to leverage some OEM technologies that brings down that development cost, but that starts to hit some of those opposing needs because perhaps your actual product costs may go up, which you can see down below is achieving cost target is actually one of the other ones that's listed there. We are a user-centered design company as well too, so obviously that's a big part of what we do and a big part of the research activities to confirm that we've done it well. So intuitive use or user interaction time, we'll always make sure that we have some of these criteria that are more usability related or usability focused. The user experience or confidence is another one that's mentioned there. So sometimes it's a matter of doing it correctly, but then also confirming, allowing the user to know that they did it correctly, especially based on the fact that some of these programs or some of these products can represent significant risk if not used appropriately. Some other ones that get into a little bit more of the project-specific ones. This one was portability, acute versus treatment, which is another acronym. So these really go to the use environments. The capital cost, so the set of capital and disposable. So sometimes there's an investment cost, which really goes to the capital, and then oftentimes it's a per procedure cost, which would require to amortize out that capital cost, or sometimes that's just a giveaway and it's not even part of that consideration. But once again, these are all the important conversations that you want to make sure you're having with the client to expose those sensitivities, because sometimes that initial investment cost for a facility or a hospital, that can be prohibitive and it ends up being the most important thing, and you don't realize it unless you have an activity like this to expose that. So what we end up doing once we have actually established this listing with the client, make sure that we've defined it appropriately, we'll end up going through a pairwise comparison where we'll compare each one of these criteria against the other one. And what that will do is actually give us a ranked rating. And one of the things that oftentimes comes out of here, which is invaluable to the overall knowledge base that's critical for us to do the development, is we'll look for thresholds. So you'll see here in some of this text, we're actually calling out $1,200 a month or a schedule delay of 12 months or greater. And it's important to find those sensitivities because sometimes those can act as cliffs. So the client may be perfectly willing to accommodate, or not perfectly willing, but they'll be tolerant of a 6-month delay. But if you get outside that 12-month cycle, that may be a cliff. That may be a funding stream issue. That may be a corporate initiative that's going to violate. There may be a competitor product that they're aware of that they're trying to get to market quicker, and they know that it's going to be out in a certain amount of months. Oftentimes the cost also has a threshold. They'll come to us with a cost target for that cost per procedure, and it may be okay if you go a couple of dollars more, but you know what? If you go to $10 instead of $5, then that's prohibitive. And that level of detail and granularity can really help make us more efficient as we execute these activities.
Yeah, and so adding to that as well, I mean, one of the times that we feel like this is really the most effective is when you start to gather the entire team together. It's so important that in this activity, you can really pull together all the members of the team, so that way you can start to get those differing opinions in the room. And that's really where you're going to push and drive a lot of the percentages here of what's most important, because if you're just really interfacing with one or two of your core client contacts there, they might have some assumptions that actually, once we start to uncover and dig deeper here, those assumptions might not be as true as you would have thought. So we found this is a great way to make sure that we really get alignment across not only within the client's team, but then within our team and together. So it's a great tool for that across the board.
Yeah, and this is an activity we've done for a long time. I will say, however, this is an activity we've started to do more on a regular basis and more recently. And that's because we saw significant value in that. And it's not just value to Ximedica, it's value to the client as well. More often than not, as we go through this activity, they have some discoveries on their own, or they take some of these decision points to a point of clarity that they hadn't achieved before. Oftentimes, there's full-on arguments. I mean, many times we've seen marketing and engineering just debating back and forth. And being witness to those conversations and those debates and more importantly, those sensitivities, it's great immersion for us.
Yeah, and even in some instances, out of this conversation can really change the strategy of the program. It might change some of the key activities or deliverables that we're marking to and actually change where the focus is of them. So we'll move into the next slide here, sort of a build on some of the same sort of things, which is really about calibrating with your client from a programmatic standpoint. And this is sort of an activity we'll often do where if we have this chart on a wall, we'll really sort of ask, all right, for this program, which blue box are you and where do you see yourself on this? Do you see yourself as sort of a Me Too product, or do you see yourself as more of a product that's really revolutionary and pushing the limits more so? And then what does that mean to the implications of that? As you start to think about, as you get more away from sort of core incremental product evolution, you're going to start to add obviously additional time and cost, and you're going to have potentially better reward as you get towards that. So we like to sort of uncover that conversation early and try to really set the stage and get in alignment with the client, because where we were in terms of originally thinking what it might be might not always be the case, and it's important to sort of allow that conversation to occur to make sure we can plot accordingly, so that way we can sort of ground ourselves in the trajectory of the program.
Yeah, and you'll see the process slides that we showed today. We've developed this process to be flexible enough to accommodate both of these extremes. I actually am pretty proud of a project that we had done for a Class 3 implantable product that was post-launch. That was them having some usability issues in the field. There was a physician interface to it. They had to make an adjustment, and they were struggling. So they came to us and asked us to do that, and you could imagine the design space was quite small within there, but we were able to formulate the tools and the processes necessary to still get them to those extremes. So it's a good model.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, you'll see that this first step that we start to really detail into the actual process. So this is our user-centered concept generation process, and the first step in it has to do with prepare. So you've heard me already use the term immersion. This is an important element for us because we need to calibrate ourselves to each one of those efforts. As mentioned at the beginning, and you saw the splash page, the types of products we do are extremely diverse, and the clients we work with are extremely diverse. And the knowledge base that they actually come to us with is a variable. So we've orchestrated a series of activities to really pull that information from them and to help further calibrate us to what knowledge exists. What are the foundational elements that we can build upon to make our execution or device development more efficient? And a complement to that is also the contextual inquiry. So we're constantly working back and forth between device development and user research. So understanding the user's perspective is a critical portion of this point in the process. So our contextual inquiries involve us going out into the field. If it's a home use product, going into the different stakeholders or target patient population, going into their environment of use, going into their bathrooms and actually see where they'd store this device. If they have any concerns about it being out exposed to the public, are there any discretion elements that we should be aware of? Humidity. dropping, tile floors, you name it. Oftentimes this is the point in the process where you see the sticky notes or the Sharpie written on things, and you get those workarounds that you realize that people have done where they've been able to adapt their environment that are key insights that we can really build upon in the overall subsequent device development.
Yeah, and this is a great opportunity to start to get your team really immersed out into that use environment. And this is where the teams really, ideally you can get individual team members out there with users in their homes, in their places of work, in that environment that you need to better understand. So that way you can really start to build empathy for user, better start to understand the nuances and frustrations of their workflow or what they're trying to achieve. So it's a really good opportunity to get your team on board with that.
Yeah, and one of the keys here at this point in the process is we're really looking for areas of focus. So as part of the concept generation activity that we're gearing up to execute, we want to figure out where those friction points are, where those key technical challenges are, so that we can actually focus on them and generate rich solutions. So ultimately, by identifying all these discrete areas, we know that if we solve all those issues, we'll come up with a successful product in the end.
So generally speaking, before we start and as we get into this immersion process and before we really want to get into the understanding of the concepting and really starting to say, what are those areas of focus? What are those specific times or moments for the user to sort of identify and focus in on more? We want to make sure we have a broad understanding as we're talking about. And so basically there's three aspects to that. First, who is the user in this scenario? And do we understand the user? And that user might be more complex than you initially thought. Are there multiple stakeholders or users in that scenario? You might have 2, 3, and you might start to rank them in primary, secondary, and even tertiary users to understand where they lie. And you create profiles for them to better understand what those users' drivers are, some of their cognitive drivers, and what that means to the program. You're going to want to better understand the use environment and the context of use. So what is the environment the product's being used in? Everything down to little details. If it's in a lab, what are the heights of the lab benches? What's the lighting like in those labs? What are the initial artifacts that are in that space that, when you look at that nice glossy image of the product in a marketing shot, really aren't included and are considered for when you get into the realities of the real world. So you really want to make sure you can get in and uncover all those. And then finally, we want to start to build out some sort of workflow. And that workflow is going to be based on what that user is doing at that time. And we're going to use that workflow as a foundational element for us to start to establish where we want to focus those key activities on. So it's sort of a working board. We'll start to use that as a place to mock up Sharpie, like Post-it note, like Joe said, and start to use that as a foundation that we're going to start the concept generation process with. So we really say, some clients come in with the beginnings of some of these activities already done. Some come in with none of it done, and it really just depends. We want to make sure that we're set up for success before we start in the actual concept gen process.
Yeah, and I think in context of that concept gen, I think if you focus your attention on the where are the opportunities there's some nice visuals of our workflows. The one in the middle is actually kind of the output of that contextual inquiry. Those are some of those key findings, some of those workarounds or some of those key issues that have been identified. Obviously, you can see on those workflows there's a lot of markups that are on there. So that's key to our process. We'll go through each one of those steps in the use flow and look for different issues, look for different opportunities that ultimately will rank and prioritize and identify which ones will be rich content for that concept generation activity. Which brings us to the next step in the process. So once we feel like we have appropriate preparation, we've built a solid foundation to proceed with, we'll actually go into the actual act of generating those solutions. So breaking down the problem is one of the fundamental, I'll say, rules here. So as mentioned before, we're really looking for a smaller, discrete problem statement that we can actually focus our attention on. So sometimes we'll call them areas of focus. And as a result of that, we'll give sufficient definition and then program-specific parameters around that. And this really just taps into how the human brain works. It's a lot easier for somebody to conceive of solutions to a smaller problem rather than asking them to define or generate solutions for a bigger one. It wouldn't be reasonable to sit down and say to somebody, develop me a surgical stapler, but you may be able to have somebody how can you actually close a jaw? How can you actually make sure that it's parallel? How can you deliver the correct force? How can you make sure your grip span to the user can be minimized? These are all elements that can be much easier to generate those solutions for rather than a larger problem. So a little bit more detail around the steps of that concept generation process. So once we have one of those areas of focus identified, we basically follow 3 steps in the process. So we put a clear definition statement on there, try to limit it to 1 or 2 sentences, really getting to the point. The parameters, once again, this goes into that calibration moment. So this is where we can state in there the time to market is critical, cost of goods and put the threshold right in there. If there's some unique user profiles or patient populations that may have some comorbidities or some dexterity issues, we can actually cite those issues that are in there. Really trying to calibrate the people as to whether, once again, this is a blue sky effort or this is an incremental improvement. And then another key point in this process is inspiration. So we have a dedicated space in each one of our facilities that we call a think tank. A lot of stimulus is in that room, and we make sure that we put the right stimulus in that environment for the particular session that we're executing. That can be physical medium, that can be printed objects, analogous references, you name it. Anything that will kind of get the creative juices flowing. We intentionally don't try to make those prescriptive to a single solution. We really try to push the mind into a different area. Really push the participants in the concept generation activity to look at the problem through a different lens to really drive the diversity of output. The sessions themselves, they'll utilize this kind of 3-panel sheet, if you will, as the basis of that. But then it's a matter of pulling together some smart people that have relevant experience, people that are just very good at doing this type of activity, creative elements, but also recognizing what type of problem it is to make sure that we, once again, increase our highest likelihood of success, increase our probability that we'll get some great solutions as a result of it. We certainly have a lot of people to draw from within Ximedica, but we also recognize if it's appropriate to go outside the building, reach out to some unique discipline. If our client has a lot of that core knowledge and they have some maybe key opinion leaders or some expertise that we should draw upon, we figure out a way to efficiently bring them into the process at the right time as well. But the key there is it's focusing on output but relative solutions, because the next point in the process is when we use all of these concept seeds that are generated into these areas of focus, and we can really look for complementary features. We can look for those concepts that are going to work really well together at hitting the ultimate goal. And we'll build systems from these discrete ideas. We don't necessarily redraw them right away. We usually pin them up on a wall. We establish them on a spectrum. We make sure that we've kind of given thought to all the unique problems that each one of these solutions needed to solve. But this allows us to work very quickly, and we can bring in new team members and react to them and mix and match as necessary to really build up a robust story. And then the refine and rank, we have some additional information on as we go forward, but I think that's one of the keys here as well. And you'll see a bunch of colored dots that are in there. At this point in the process, we're resistant to quantifying that down selection process. We're really focusing on more relative comparisons between each one of these solutions, leveraging those key metrics that we had identified and ranked at the beginning of the process to make sure that we're giving the appropriate weight to the real critical elements, but also giving holistic thought to what the overall needs of the project are.
Okay, great. Good. Yeah, so the next step here is as we start to get through those initial system solutions, we'll start to filter and sort somewhat. So we're going to gather sort of an intro slide here as we start to think about how we want to do that filter and sort process. It's really important to the teams here. This is where we might want to pull in other folks from the team or outside to come in, and we'll start that process of sort of ranking them. There's numerous different ways that we can approach that, but we sort of want to choose the best method that's appropriate for that particular context as well. So as we sort of look to the next slide here, I think this is a great image that starts to speak to the sort of how dynamic these sessions can be. And it's really important that when we start to have these sessions and we start to build these initial system solutions, they can be pretty dynamic and pretty loose. You'll see the nature of them. A lot of the paper and the space, sketches and things are organized on individual sheets. You'll find that there's actual, so they can be moved sort of accordingly. You can quickly remove an idea or add an idea. At this point, we don't want to gather too many thoughts onto one page because then that doesn't allow us to be dynamic and change something. So this is really about getting the right group of the team together, so a broader team group together to start to dig into each one of these initial systems. We'll take those systems, we're going to put them across a spectrum. That spectrum usually has two opposing needs at either end. So we'll have, it could be anywhere from, I don't want to dictate the exact number, but it could be anywhere from 4 to 8 solutions, maybe more, depending on what the right number is to make sure that we fulfilled the amount of concepts necessary to really explore what was needed to understand those two opposing needs that we were looking at. We'll sort of rank or list the different systems based on different attributes, and those different attributes should be key drivers across the program, and they'll be sort of ordered or stacked among each one of them. And then the team's going to work together to sort of work through each one of the systems. We can either refine it on the fly at that time or start to uncover sort of nuances from the client at that point that we might want to remove or add or change. So this is a really important part of the step, a really important step in the process that we have with the clients, and it's really great for alignment, and it's critical that we get the alignment we need here before we can really get into the next step of our process here.
Yeah, and as mentioned, we're a consultancy, so we work for our clients, and this represents an evolution in our process as well. We used to have concept generation sessions, 1-2-day marathons, if you will, and we'd ask our clients to participate in them. And it's not necessarily their forte. There were certainly examples where the clients did great, but there were some other ones where putting them on the spot with a pencil in hand and saying, you got to draw, you got to think of something, it wasn't necessarily the best use of their time or their skill set. So by being able to work independently and without the kind of, I don't want to say burden, but without the client being in the room, it allows us to be more flexible. It allows us to maybe violate some of those rules that they had established so that we can go into some uncharted waters and potentially identify something that was very unique that we wouldn't have got to if we had somebody that was saying, hey, yeah, no, we don't want to do that. So by allowing us that freedom, it really allows us to kind of flex our creative juices as well. It also, in a very critical way, it allows us to do some appropriate serial iteration. So oftentimes within these sessions, somebody will identify something, they'll draw a sketch, and somebody else will be like, hey, you know what, there's a material that does that. It's a new thing, it's pretty cool, or a process that will allow you to do something faster, cheaper, you name it. That allows us to identify that as an activity. Somebody can go out, do some research on that, then bring that knowledge back to the group, and then we can actually iterate on that. So it allows us to kind of stair-step that process to really get to some very exciting areas. And by putting these up, you can see on these boards that these are those same concept seed sketches. The system is built up of these discrete elements. And then we allow the client to react to that. And if there's one element that they don't like, it's as easy as walking up to the board and pulling it down, dropping on the floor, and then bringing them over to a board that may have 50 or 60 other ideas on it. Or hopefully, better yet, they actually say, hey, you know what, we should try to do something like this. If that's the case, they draw it, we draw it, but it gets pinned up there. And you really get this dynamic evolution that is a little bit of a down selection, but more importantly, it's a build up of the really systems that we think have the highest likelihood of success.
Every time after we do one of these sessions, you'll find that I don't think there hasn't been a time that everyone has said, especially from the client side, that I am exhausted from the time that I just spent here today. And usually they leave exhausted and pretty happy. So it's really an important part of our process, and it's really key to the success of a lot of these programs.
So the next step here is these systems. So obviously that session represents a more higher level kind of, you're identifying the major elements and giving some definition to that system. But there still needs to be a refinement stage that goes into that. So as Tom mentioned, there's no hard numbers. 4 to 8 reasonable to go through there, but usually we end up with kind of the 3 to 5 in that range that we're actually going to do that detailing activity of. Can't stress enough that we are, even in our proposals, we're careful not to tie ourselves to a number because we always want to generate the right number of solutions. We want to make sure that that spectrum is rounded out appropriately and that we're considering the extremes on both sides. It's very rarely the extremes that you pick, but the extremes can really drive some of those better conversations. Yeah, so this is an example of just one of the systems that we can build for a type of product. You can see here the storyboards that give the high-level function. We're breaking down the use steps and really detailing how we've actually solved for each one of those critical use functions, tying it once again back to that workflow where we identified those critical areas. Depending on the project, too, sometimes there's significant technical challenges. Other times it's a matter of just identifying the right core technologies that may exist in the marketplace and putting them together. So we do want to make sure that we're rounding out that story, focusing on those highest risk areas, and always have a defensible solution that we're able to say, this is why we did it, and this is why it's a good idea.
Yeah, and you'll see over to the side here as we start to think about this entire the system scenario here, we really want to start to walk through, even from a use perspective, we'll do some quick sketches that really pay off in terms of starting to envision what that user experience is like. Those will often start to think about often the end-to-end process of the product, those nuances around what are those experiences like, how does it streamline from either from a physical digital experience or across the different environments of use. Depending on what the product is, we can sort of cater this to be the appropriate size. And then you'll see down below there's even opportunities as well. Like Joe said, you'll go out and you'll start to do some of that additional research or that secondary research. You want to make sure that the concept that you're starting to embody is technically feasible, right? So are we able to sort of find technologies that we think that we can start to say we can bed into the product here, they're going to allow us to give us these sort of visions that we have for the system, because we want to make sure the things that we're starting to incorporate as a system can really be perceived and embodied in an actual product embodiment.
Yeah, great point. And I think the other thing that you're really starting to identify at this point in the process is what's the next step too. Yeah. As you're building out these storyboards or these system solutions, if you're about to embark on an engineering effort, then we need to make sure we're highlighting those key risk areas and where some of those unknowns are. If the next step in the process is more appropriate to do as a research activity, then you're starting to identify those key user steps and where those questions really are and what we want to bring into the field to really get those answered. Okay, so the next point in the process is the evaluate. So I mentioned earlier on in the process, we do try to resist quantifying at this point in the process, but hopefully at this point you understand that we've established a spectrum of markedly different solutions, and you need to guide through that down selection process. So relative comparisons is a great way to do this, and identifying those key metrics and start to put some text in place as to why this does it in a good manner, or why maybe there's some considerations or some trade-offs as to why this may not be the best solution for that particular criteria. But you tend to get a nice progression. Tom's mentioned the opposing needs, and that's the key. So as you put these systems in place, you've already identified that these systems will identify the opposing needs in different ways, and there's different strengths and weaknesses on that spectrum. So by starting to put that evaluation steps in place, that allows us that information.
Yeah, and it's important here that we have this on the slide as well around concept feedback, and this is a great point that if you want to, there's an opportunity here before you get in that evaluation, can you add user feedback around the system that you've started to define? So can you get out there and do some early research with users, do either contextual inquiries, do some focused testing with special advisors maybe that you have assigned to the program, and use those expert opinions to start to weigh into the evaluation. You don't have to do that step, but it's a step that we find is really beneficial when you're able to do it. It allows you to really start to round out some of the list of criteria that we went through earlier, especially when you get into that user section that Joe talked about, and you start to define that. It really makes sure that they're grounded in some of the constraints and around the systems that we've started to define here. And we'll define different levels of stimulus that we can take in to the field with us, but ultimately it's important that that's a good opportunity to get in front of the users at this point.
Yeah. So in terms of this evaluation, here's some examples around that informed down selection. And this is examples of how we're guiding through that process. So for this particular project, we had identified these 3 criteria that we had actually prioritized to actually have that relative comparison on. So impact to routine, that's a user or a lifestyle consideration. Cost of goods, pretty straightforward. And then development time and cost, as mentioned before, that's the required dollars and time to bring the program or the development to that established milestone. And sliders is a good way to do this. And you can see we never put the slider all the way to the end, because once again, we don't want people taking out a tape measure to try to figure out, well, if I add these all together, this one won. You really just want to get that relative comparison. Try to understand where those trade-offs exist to guide through the process. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet that I think is another critical point, you don't want to get to one solution at this point in the process. You want to leave this point in the process with multiple offerings because there's too much risk if you don't. So one of the key things that will kill an overall timeline or schedule is hitting a dead end and needing to go back into this process. So by design, by model, we always leave this process with multiple solutions we have confidence in, and then the subsequent user research, the subsequent engineering activities will do that down selection, will do that kind of investigation to bring you to that single solution. To bring us all the way back to that triangle slide where we're balancing the business and the technical and the user needs. Until you've actually proven that your solution can appropriately satisfy all 3 of those, you need to carry forth that redundancy. Some of the other elements that we have here, this was an important one for this project, was actually the regulatory path. So some of our solutions got us into a Class 1, some other solutions got us into a Class 2. And the detail on the bottom of the slide really kind of details out that trade-offs in each one. So for this particular project, there was 6 functions that we had identified. They were really kind of program goals, and some of those were must-haves, some of those were nice-to-haves. And by going through and creating this progression of technology, this progression of features that each one of these systems does, you see the tangible benefit that you can get from that. But then you have to put that in context to say, okay, this one still gives me the core feature. This one still represents the minimum viable product because it did everything it must do. It's a shorter regulatory path, shorter development in time, and but you know what? The impact on routine, I'm not really getting there. The cost of goods is still not really where I want it. So it's that trade-off, and it's giving the information to the decision makers to really make an informed decision as to how to proceed.
Yeah, and to Joe's point, you'll often, as you move forward with these multiple systems, and you maybe at this point, maybe you're moving forward with 2 or 3 systems, and they're going to be pushing to each one of these ends of these sliders here in a lot of ways. You know, ideally, as you move forward and you start to uncover more, you're going to be able to start to embed those or embody those into the elements of those systems that you really like the most, and hopefully embed them more into a system solution that's going to work best for your application. Yeah, so in order to do that and be able to, as we start to go out and start to think about getting out more into the research side of things, getting back to that concept feedback like we talked about before, a lot of times we'll work, and as we created these systems, we'll say to ourselves, what are the key areas that we want to assess to better understand where we need more information in that is going to help guide us back to this, back to each one of these systems. So we'll take a sort of set of time here, and we'll sort of focus in what we think is core, and we define them as assessment areas. Those assessment areas, we might have 2, 3, 4, or more, depending on the complexity of the project, but they're the areas that we sort of have agreed to as a team that we need to focus on that are going to get us to that next step, that are going to allow us to get to that next step in the phase. So there's different ways we can achieve that, and there's different avenues in which we can have the research team start to look at these different areas. So we'll often create different things to do that and sort of get the right sort of be able to allow us to ask the right questions of users. We'll be able to bring out things like 2D sketches or storyboards that start to speak to specific topics. And you'll often find that some of the illustrations and images that we create for this on a 2D level are really focused in on a specific question. They're not going to be trying to you're not going to be able to take the sketch of the initial concept and just show that to a user. It's going to be too distracting at that point, too many variables on the page, and we really want to focus in on what's core to that assessment area that we want feedback on, and what is it that we're looking to get from that user at that point. We'll often like to put things in their hands. We'll create foam models. We'll create system-level models. We'll be able to put it in the user's hands. We want to be able to start to get a sense of just watching them interact with the device, better understand how does that fit into their pocket, how does that fit into garments they currently have, how does that interact with other objects and things they have in their space. And then we'll often do participatory design activities as well. We're with users at that point when we're still early on and we maybe have an idea. We might even put an activity in front of them. Can they start to rank things that are important to them? Rank variables around their lifestyle, variables of the product that seem more important to them in that particular embodiment. And a lot of times when we use this, we can start to pull some data from this and start to use that as a way to organize the efforts as we start to move forward in the process.
Yeah, we did an exercise recently, and it was highly successful, and it was an ambulatory product, so a lot of home use environment, and we did it with participants, and we were trying to figure out what buttons would be appropriate, how many, what should be on them. So we had this participatory design activity where we had the major functions identified, and they were on little tiles. But people were able to pick them up, put them in the right spot, and we gave them blank ones. And some people were writing in what they'd like these different buttons to be. And it was a very efficient activity because we started to see some patterns. So we started to see some consistency in what people needed and where they'd put them. And so it not only established what buttons we'd need and how many, but it also gave us a hierarchy as well. So it's a great way to solicit just on-point information.
Yeah.
Another point to emphasize here, too, is just this isn't a one-and-done activity. So this should be done at the right time throughout the development process. You can see that foam model in the top right, it's a solid foam model. It doesn't have moving buttons, and it's inferring some different features that are on there. But the other ones that we had were much different shapes. They were shorter, squatter, squares. There were major architectural variations. So by bringing these into the field early on, you realize these different nuances. You realize that people want to be able to fit it in this pocket, or they always put these things in these cup holders or these sleeves, and it would be great if you could fit it here. And so by going out and getting that early information, it makes that engineering and the follow-on activities much more efficient because you're making macro-level changes early on in the process.
Yeah, so as we start to get into these, as we got out to the field, we started to analyze some of these particular, foam models or sketches with users. We're going to start to gather the insights there. And a lot of times we'll gather the insights. We're going to sort of pull them together. There's a lot of distilling of the information that we do. We'll want to take the top insights. We like to do this really while the information is still fresh. A lot of times, even as we're out in the field, some of these things can happen off to the side as you're coming out, and you'll be starting to start to sort of gather, down select, put like-minded ththings together so you can really start to think about what those top insights are that you've started to see when you're out in the field. When we're out and when we're asking people to participate in these research activities, when we're looking at stimulus, we're going to take a lot of images. We'll take hundreds and hundreds of images, many hours of video and audio that we can always go back and reference to. We find that the photography that we're able to capture in those times, even if that moment you don't think that one photo might be valuable, we're always going back to go look at images of how something was done or how that changed, because it maybe wasn't quite as important at that time, but you realize actually is a couple weeks later when you're up against another challenge. So it's really important to document the best you can. And again, at this point, you're really looking to make sure that you're having the right team with you at that time. So this isn't something that we just isolate to just a research activity. We're going to be bringing in the design with the research engineers coming into the field to be able to see a lot of these things firsthand, to be able to get that context and that foundation of learnings that's so important that you'll have as sort of a database and a bank as you move forward into the project. Some images on the screen that we have here start to speak to how we start to distill that information. A lot of times we want to take the information that we're gathering, what's meaningful from that, how can we put that into a way that illustrates sort of the insights that we've gathered. We do that a lot of times through quotes that we've heard firsthand. A lot of times the quotes are important as well as the observations. So again, back to the photos, what we're able to illustrate with photos is observations that we've seen that maybe the user didn't initially say, but they actually did. And a lot of times those can be even just as insightful or more than what the user is actually telling us word for word. And when we start to gather these things and these insights together, we'll often sort of make sure that we do it across the right user segment, user populations. We'll want to make sure it's diverse enough across whatever it is that we're working on. So we'll gather segments of the different types of users from that particular category, and then we'll start to crunch those down. And this can be a huge subset of users, or this can be really small and focused. So we can really scale this activity to whatever is appropriate at that particular either earlier on in the project or later on in the project when it might need to be a little larger.
Yeah, and this is a healthy mix of art and science. And to Tom's point about the patient or the number of participants, there's a lot of discretion that goes in there. You want to make sure that you have a representative patient population, but then you can't afford to go out and interview 1,000 people. So that's something we really kind of leverage our experience and leverage a lot of the upfront research to identify the different effects that maybe geographical location should have, age, gender, race, you name it. We put all that considerations in place to build what we think is the appropriate sample size for each step in the activity to make sure that the outputs that we have would be representative of an entire population as opposed to some of these unique subsets that may give us the wrong information or may put our priorities in the wrong place. All right. So this last slide here, this is kind of our summary slide. So this kind of shows all the information, all the steps that we've done in the process so far. You can see the thread across the top is really more of our concept generation activities and some of the technical considerations, where the bottom is really how we're stitching in those research activities and understanding which one goes first, which one's feeding off of them. This is really the dynamic part in that process. We're not afraid to put our hand up and say, you know what? We gotta pivot here. We're doing our concept gen, but we're not able to appropriately identify good concepts, or we feel like we need more information in terms of the capabilities of our users. Let's do a quick research activity or a quick research or investigational research activity, which may be anthropometrics, human factors, technical, you name it. Or we may say, you know what? We're going to recommend that we're going to pivot here and do some user research to help inform that. So while we like to kind of script these steps together at the beginning of the process, it's important to know when you don't know enough information and then react accordingly.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about this slide as well is that it's scalable, right? I mean, this activity here and this chart really starts to speak to, it could be something that's very small, that's a couple months, and this could be something that's much larger, or even just could be within a few, a weeks or something like, so very scalable, and we want to make sure that you don't necessarily, some of these research activities, you can sort of start to, as you get into it, you can sort of choose what's most appropriate at that time, and you can sort of pull in and build out and create that process that makes it the right fit for your project at that time. So I think it's really important that this process is one that's dynamic enough that it can fit and flex into where you need it to be and scale into the size of the program that you have at that time.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
All right. So with that said, we'll open it up for any questions.
That's great. Great talk. So yeah, we have a few minutes here, so we can do a few questions. I guess the first one we have here is, okay, so I mean, how is this process different for startups versus major medical device companies?
Okay. Yeah, I can take that one. That's a good question, actually. I will jump back to some of the calibration steps. So as mentioned, sometimes the major medical looks a lot like a startup, and sometimes we get surprised by maybe a well-funded startup that may look more like a major medical. So we don't take anything for granted as part of this process, and by going through this activity where we're really identifying those programmatic goals, some of those business drivers that are really linked to their value proposition, that's how we can be, the process itself is agnostic to a startup or a major medical. This activity helps calibrate us to be in line with their business goals such that we can act and develop the product accordingly.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So it's almost like the process helps you calibrate, between those, so you can kind of like respond to them no matter what kind of company they are, then, right?
Absolutely. Yep, you got it. I mean, I'll cite a recent experience that we had. We had a major medical come in, and it's an early phase project. They have an idea of a product that they're hopeful that there's technology that would be supportive of it. We kicked off the activity, and we went through this exercise with them. We started to populate it, and all of a sudden we realized all that mattered was showing efficacy. So they didn't care how much it cost. They didn't care whether it was currently used in medical. They cared whether or not you could get a technology to do this. And it was amazing that they had never said that to us. And it wasn't, if we hadn't done this activity, it wouldn't have exposed the fact that they really were just looking for that. And you can imagine we may have looked at some technologies that we would have thought, hey, that's not appropriate for medical, let's not consider it. Hey, that would be really expensive. They'd never be able to pursue that. So it's a great opportunity to really help get in the brain of the client so we can act in the best interest of them.
Yeah, and at that point, what that really did was it actually changed the strategy of the program at that point and really helped us redefine where the focus was of our activities. So it was that was a pivotal moment, I think, in that project to make sure that we were going to meet the needs of what was necessary to be successful to get them to their next goal, really.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I mean, you've got a ton of design roots, and it seems like half the time when I hear some kind of discussion related to medical device design, brainstorming inevitably comes up. I mean, why didn't you do that here? Why didn't we hear about brainstorming?
Because we banished the word. So
right.
Very intentionally, brainstorming comes across as a much more random activity. So somewhat synonymously, that's actually what we refer to as our concept generation activity. And the idea there is that by giving more context, more background, more research, more basis to the activity, that you get better output, that the quality of the output is much greater than if you just grab a few people and say, hey, think of some stuff, let's go. It also is better use of the time as well, too, as doing that preparatory steps that I was describing before with some of those 3-panel sheets and making sure we've appropriately defined everything. That allows us to bring other people that aren't core team members up to speed in a few minutes, and then they're actively producing. Where if we just grab them and we've had to explain it verbally, it may take you a half hour, 45 minutes of an hour meeting to get them up to speed before they can start to generate.
Yeah, that's really neat. It almost sounds like you made sure that there was some good structure there so that, because traditional brainstorming, I've noticed, can really get out of control. So you get some structure in there so you get some value out of it. That's really neat.
Yeah. And as part of that structure, Chris, a lot of times we'll want to make sure that you have them, like to that point, you have a moderator in that session that is, you're going to bring people in and the right group of people, as Joe is talking about. But at the same time, you want to make sure you have somebody who's able to moderate that session and keep things on task. So that way you're able to appropriately drive the course and get to the output that's necessary. And, that person has the goal to make sure that everyone in that room is able to produce what's necessary, and different people in the room have different objectives and should be whether you have a human factors engineer working with an industrial designer and an EE, they're each going to be approaching it from a little bit different of a perspective. So it's a lot of times it's that moderator's job to make sure they're threading the things together and making sure that the session is an effective use of time, really.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so do you have a method of determining the optimum communication strategy for a given client? I mean, like conference calls 3 times a week versus once a month, or using visual aids, or written reports. I mean, how do you figure that out?
Yeah, it's actually a really important element and definitely a unique consideration for each one of the engagements we have. The easiest answer there is we certainly have a steady frequency of regular meetings with the client. So we leverage GoToMeeting, WebEx. We do prepare a program dashboard for each one of those initiatives. Any of the major activities that are going on, whether it's research or engineering or design, they're represented as unique sections within that dashboard. And each one of those dashboards is right-sized for the activity and the client. So we actually have some programmatic, kind of schedule and budget information that's in there as well. But we make sure we cater that activity to be unique to the engagement. We also don't want to burden a smaller program that we have to act a little bit more efficiently on. Maybe it's a quick hitter, low budget. Then we can actually right-size that communication tool. Conversely, if it's a very large effort with a lot of multidisciplinary teams, and especially if the client is actually some of the core team members, if they're actually representing some of the development threads on their end, we make sure we stitch their activities into that dashboard as well, because it's a bidirectional communication tool, and those meetings are a critical element to facilitate that.
Yeah, and that meeting as well is critical that does happen on a weekly basis, because a lot of times it'll help us avoid any pitfalls as well. We're going to talk about things that we're currently working on, things that we've done and where we're headed, and in that context, it's a great opportunity to make sure that the core team, as they're sort of driving, that the client is sort of aligned with what the goals are of what they're driving to. So it's really important that there's a great chance for the client to be like, well, wait a second, have you thought about this? Or add a new point that maybe we didn't realize, or at the same time maybe put the brakes on something that was necessary to do at that moment. So it's a great way to see the finer detail of really what's going on within the team on a week-by-week basis. So they're really effective in that fashion, and pretty worthwhile.
Yeah, and nothing beats a face-to-face meeting as well, too. So one of the things we do try to do is establish the different milestones that would be more conducive to having that be an in-person meeting, and make sure that schedules are clear, that it's anticipated well ahead of time.
Yeah, so it's sounding to me that, overall, like, regular communication is, like, really important. This isn't like a we'll check back once a month type of thing. Like, this is a process where there needs to be a lot of communication with the client in order to ensure that, there's a good result for them.
Yeah, and you'll often find that individual team members are going to be communicating with the client, usually sometimes even on a daily basis at times. This is even more formalized as a weekly, but you'll see that our program managers or key leads on programs sometimes even have as much as daily communication with the client. So it's really what's appropriate for that project. We want to make sure that we're able to do that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, it looks like we're almost to the end here. If anyone has, any additional questions, please send them in. We can answer them down the road. So just to wrap up our process here, we just a few additional, just basically. Joe, Tom, thanks. Thanks again for this great webinar. I mean, it was really interesting to hear you, delve into your whole process for producing, medical devices. It's neat to get kind of like that that look under the hood of how an agency like yours works.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was. We had fun today. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, that was great. And just a few, quick housekeeping items before we finish this webinar. It's going to be available at medicaldesignoutsourcing.com. You can, check out some of our tweets and the comments from this webinar at #MDOwebinar and the handle @Ximedica. And please, connect with medical, design outsourcing on, various social media channels. So this is, this is Chris Newmarker, Managing Editor of Mass Devices, Medical Design and Outsourcing. Thanks again for listening to our webinar about innovation risk reduction. I hope you have a good day. Thanks a lot.